write English. And I discovered comics when I was about 5 years old. And I was able to put the words and the pictures together. And I learned how to speak and write English as a result of reading comics. So I think that in a lot of ways that had a very profound effect on me. You know, some would say that it scarred me for life, but it's the kind of a scar that I think I've been able to turn into a living. Comics and the power of images, you know, one of the things that I really focus on, and I teach a class in Manhattan and in New York, and one of the things that I focus on in the class is the power of images and the power of storytelling, and that it's much more effective to get your message across when you're telling a story than it is just to say, you know, facts or figures. Stories are really a very old and historic way of communicating. Cavemen used to sit around the fire and tell stories. You know, all of you, I think, have been raised on fairy tales. You know, those are stories, they're lessons, you know. Yeah, and so I think that that's to a large degree, the beginning of my love of comics and storytelling.
And now, on a biographical note, it should be noted, you say you couldn't write or read in English. That's because you were born in Germany and you immigrated when you were 5, so you just came to the States and that was your way in to the culture, in a sense.
Yeah.
So, could you tell us a bit, so like many of us, you're a child, you're captivated by the medium, you start drawing, that's the process a lot of us go through, but most of us don't become artists at the end. Could you tell us about your first days or years in the industry, how that came about, what did you do, and how did you find success?
You know, when I was a kid, there were, you know, a couple of times when I thought I was interested in other things. You know, there was a time I wanted to be a fireman. There was a time when I really wanted to be an astronaut. I really wanted to be the first man on Mars. You know, you're a kid. You have dreams. You have other ideas. You have other interests. I was always interested in astronomy. I was always interested in science. But the thing that I really loved is drawing and sitting at a table and, you know, let me approach it to you this way. I didn't have a lot of friends when I was a kid. Like a lot of us, I think, you know, you're geeks and you're nerds and you feel a little outcast and you feel separate and apart from, you know, I was never a jock. I was never, you know, the big man on campus. I was never the most popular. You know, I got beat up a lot as a kid. People, I don't know how much detail I want to give you about that, but trust me,
we're all ears.
No, that's fine. We'll leave it at that. But trust me, I was from a different country. I wore different clothing. I had different haircut. You know, we spoke a different language. We ate different food. You know, and if you're a little bit different. You guys know this. You're a little bit different. You become ostracized, and you know you're part of a minority, and you get picked on. And I got picked on a lot. So the thing that was safe for me was sitting in my room and drawing, and it was secure. I didn't have to deal with all that other stuff. That was really, you know, that was painful. It was tough, and I think that to a large degree. That motivated me and allowed me, gave me some sort of a permission or a bubble where I could develop some creativity that I found very satisfying. And it was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed drawing, even to this day. If I don't draw for a couple of days, I climb the walls, I go crazy. I need to do that. And I think that combination of wanting to be creative and the combination of wanting to be safe, I often refer to, and maybe this is too much information, but I often refer to my drawing board as a life raft. You know, it's a tough world out there, and it's nice to come home and sit down at the drawing board and draw and feel like, you know, today was a good day. I did some good work. You know, I'm proud of myself. You know, I solved some problems. You know, there's practical reasons for being an artist, and also, you know, emotional reasons.
You're talking about your experience as an immigrant kid in the States, and there's actually a theory in the comic studies field that superheroes aren't an American cultural icon, but an immigrant cultural icon, right? I mean, immigrants, they go to another country, and especially second generation children, they feel different, but they want to be part of society. And in that sense, that dual identity is very similar to the superhero, right? Who can contribute, but, you know, Lois Lane doesn't have a problem, you know, rejecting Clark Kent, and Peter Parker gets beat up in his Middlewood High School or whatever the name is. And you work recently with Gene Luen Yang on Superman, right? Am I right?
Right.
So Gene Luen Yang, if you know, is a Chinese American. He has done various graphic novels on the immigrant experience, and he was commissioned to do Superman for DC. Am I right? I mean, and he's still writing it?
Yeah, he's now writing the Chinese Superman.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Talking about immigrant. So, and you know what? That could maybe take us to the next question. So, how in the States, comics is a collaborative medium. How would you describe working? It could be about Gene Luen Yang or about other writers or editors. How does that process work? Has it changed, or I mean, how if you attribute things going on?
Well, the comic books. You know, when Asaf says collaborative, it means you don't work alone. You work with other people. It's an assembly line. And the assembly line has good things and bad things about it. You know, in the last couple of years, I'm sure you guys know that there's been a lot of creator-owned work. So people own their own properties, they write and they draw their own properties, their own characters, and that's become much more widespread and accepted. So if any of you have ideas, you know, you want to write and draw your own books, your own characters, whatever it is, you should really pursue it. I think the assembly line way of working, which means a writer, penciler, inker, colorist, letterer, editor, you know, everybody does their own little piece of the pie, so to speak, is useful for books that are on a deadline, especially a deadline. So in order to turn out a monthly book, which most books are on a monthly schedule, it's hard for somebody to do that by himself or herself. It's just physically difficult. It takes too much time. So what the industry came up with way back in the 30s and 40s, mostly the 40s, was, you know, one person would write, another person would pencil, another person would ink, and while the inker is inking the pencils, the penciler is already working on the next issue or another book. So you're able to do many, many more books and many more pages, and you know, to kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Generate a better living, because you're doing more pages, you're making more money, you're able to feed yourself, feed your family, you know, your cats and your dogs, whatever. So the assembly line has its merits, and the independent creator who does everything by himself or herself also has its merits. I don't think, by the way, any less of the assembly line than someone doing it all by himself. I think they're both artistic, and they both fall into the category of art. It's just different.
So in your career, what have you found were, as you said, the merits, and what were, I'll say, challenges and not difficulties of this assembly line process?
Well, one of the challenges, I think, is that not every combination of people works well together. So I may get a penciler, we'll talk about penciling and inking, I may get a penciler and I'm not particularly suited for that style of penciling. I may not be right for that specific penciler. I'll give you an example. I don't know if you guys know Giuseppe Camuncoli. He did Spider-Man for Marvel a couple of years ago, and he's still doing work. Anyways, I loved his pencils, and I thought we made an amazing fit. And Marvel agreed, and so did Giuseppe. I went to DC, so our working relationship ended. But there was an example of a recent combination that really worked, as far as I was concerned. Great stuff. I thought the combination really worked. Adam Kubert and I can't. It doesn't work. I remember I inked a couple of pages of Adam and just hated it. And I agreed, it didn't work. We just didn't mesh. Gene Colan, some of you may know his work. He's an old timer. Tough, very, very, very difficult to ink. And I felt like I never really understood how to do that, how to ink him. Gil Kane, who was my favorite American artist, I inked him. He was the fourth job that I ever got. Way back in 1973, I inked him for the first time, and then I inked him again 10 years later, and again 10 years later. And it wasn't until the very, very last time that I inked him that I thought I figured it out. So there's, not all combinations of artists, writers, inkers, pencilers, colorists work. So if you work by yourself, you only have yourself to blame. If you work with other people, you can easily say, well, Adam Kubert, he sucks as a penciler, I can't do anything with this guy, which I would never say in public.
Do you say it to Andy Kubert, whom you work with?
Yes. Andy, by the way, I think Andy and I have a good working relationship and a good combination. And Andy tells me he's very happy with my inks, and I hope that's true. We're probably going to do more work together. So that's a combination that works.
So Andy and Adam Kubert are brothers. They're both artists in the industry, and they're the sons of Joe Kubert, the legendary Joe Kubert. And saying you work well with Andy and not Adam, I imagine there may be fights, Yom Shishi. So you start work in the 1970s, and I think we talked about it in our previous panel.
Sure.
Your breakthrough was in the 1980s, especially working together with Frank Miller on Daredevil and of course The Dark Knight. Could you tell us a bit about your process with him, or about him as a person and your working together?
Well, when I started working with Frank on Daredevil, it's important to say that Daredevil, I was already on Daredevil, and Daredevil was my book, and so there were a lot of pencilers that came along prior to Frank, and my job was to keep the look of the book as consistent as possible, which was not that easy because the different pencilers had very, very different styles. But one of the things, and it sounds silly at this point, but one of the things that I very much tried to do was keep Matt Murdock's glasses the same. So I had a pair of glasses at home, which I still have, and I based his glasses on the pair of glasses that I had at home, because Bob Brown would draw Matt Murdock differently in his glasses. Gil Kane would draw differently. They wouldn't look at each other's work, they would just do what they felt best. So my job was, to keep the look the same. When Frank came on, he was just another one of those guys. He wasn't the Frank Miller that we know today. He was a kid from Vermont who was trying to break into comics, and he had done a couple of jobs before Daredevil. And Daredevil was on the verge of being canceled. It was a bi-monthly book. No one was looking at it, and apparently no one was reading it, no one was buying it. And so they gave it to Frank because, he was like the low man on the totem pole, and nobody cared about Daredevil. and we started working together, you know, at that point. Frank, when he started doing Daredevil, they were very, very tight pencils, and eventually his tight pencils wound up to nothing. And I mean that literally. He, at the end of our tenure on the book, which was about 3 years, maybe some change, he was drawing the book on 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper, which is typewriter paper, just blank, white, ordinary typewriter paper. And he would, you know, draw the box, the frame of the book, the dimensions of the book, and he would break the panels down in pencil, and then he would write the dialogue in the balloons and draw the scene. And then he would give me those pages in pencil, and I would draw them up on the board and ink them, and at a certain point color them also. So we went from very tight pencils to loose pencils to breakdowns to typewriter paper. And I think in a lot of ways, my, you know, if I could, you know, say this, it sounds so pretentious, my artistic development really took a turn during that period of time, because Frank allowed me to have greater influence on the pages. He was very generous that way. He allowed me to develop and have a heavier footprint. You know, Frank, we were talking recently, and Frank was talking about how much he learned about inking from me. And he said, "Do you remember the time I came over your apartment and you taught me how to ink?" And I have no memory of this, you know, none whatsoever. But I mentioned that because if he thinks that I influenced his inking, he influenced my penciling and storytelling enormously. Not only because he trusted me on Daredevil to work together and to contribute more than the usual collaborator, but because I also studied his work. And we talked about, you know, his technique, and I learned a lot from him. I still do, you know, if I might say, before we started DK3, I went and reread Dark Knight Returns, which was the first one. I'm so impressed with what Frank did in that book that there's nothing that can take away from that accomplishment. And I think that, you know, I'll say this, I think that when Frank and I get together, we recognize that in each other. And it's like two people who went through something together, and nothing can ever take that from us. We experienced that. We experienced the reaction to Dark Knight. We experienced the evolution of storytelling and art and becoming better. And that's not anything that anyone can take away from either one of us. And that's a valuable thing. It's a very valuable thing.
So on The Dark Knight, I wanted to ask you, how did that happen? I mean, the comics industry isn't known as the most innovative industry, especially the big two. We're talking the 1980s. And this is a book, it was done on a major superhero with complete freedom, untethered to continuity and all those questions you usually ask. I mean, what world is it in? It's in parallel universe 69445 or whatever. So really, I mean, just the story behind the book, how did it come to pass?
You know, there's one person who doesn't get enough credit. There's probably more than just the one person I'm about to mention, but one person was the editor-in-chief at that time, which was Dick Giordano. Dick really wanted to, he, I think, essentially proposed the idea to Frank, that I think the idea was they wanted to do something different with Batman in particular, because Batman wasn't selling very well at that time, and they wanted to get away from the Adam West stuff, the TV show. And Dick asked